What would happen if an unidentified aerial object appeared over a major U.S. city during wartime? Would we stand by quietly and watch, wait to see what happens next? Or would the result be hours of panic, chaos, and even death? While this sounds like the topic of a Hollywood blockbuster, this very real event took place in California during the height of World War II. This is UFOs Revisited, and I'm Aaron Deese. Joining me once again are Ron Murphy, Heather Mosier, Katie Page, Micah Hanks, and Seth Breedlove. So we're talking about a very interesting case because unlike some of the topics we've discussed, some of the reports we've examined, there is no doubt that this happened. This happened. And the summary of events is pretty straightforward. This was during World War II. This was at a time when we were very, very conscious of things coming into the country from the sky, from other places. And this is a theme that we talked about before that I'm sure we'll discuss at length today, but it sort of has this theme of the other appearing and coming into a place that's very significant to us beyond our control. But the progression of this event is very well documented. The Office of Naval Intelligence had issued a warning the same day that this event occurred that they expected an attack on California to take place within 12 hours. This was an official bulletin that was put out by the military. So already people are on alert. People are a little bit antsy, a little bit anxious, as any of us would be. The craft, and we'll discuss what that is or what that was sighted on radar by the military around 7 p.m. The city was put on alert and a citywide blackout was ordered. So again, we're thinking about World War II at a time when bombs were literally falling from the sky on populated areas. Right away, what do you guys think about this? What do you know about this case? And we'll continue to discuss the narrative, but
maybe just a little preceding information would be warranted here because, I mean, in order to establish the sentiments among Americans right at that time and really whatever was occurring in the skies over Los Angeles, why people felt the way they did and why they were being warned about an imminent attack. Naturally, of course, that day that will live in infamy, the attack on Pearl Harbor, I mean, not only brought us into the war and an official war declaration, but I mean, Americans were now, I mean, prepared to get into the thick of it. We also had on February 23rd, 1942, interrupting President Roosevelt's fireside chat, we had the shelling of a oil field there near Santa Barbara, California, I believe. And so, I mean, people were very concerned. And even though that was more symbolic, I think it was the I-17 submarine that had launched a few shells. It was more to say, hey, we can do this. And they wanted to keep Americans on edge and also to interrupt, Roosevelt's, fireside chat. It was enough to concern people. It really had them worried. And so these were all events leading up to what's occurring the early morning hours between February 24th and 25th when something appears in the skies over Los Angeles. And so naturally, I mean, the city lights go black, air raid sirens are blaring, people are taking cover, and sure enough, we begin firing at something.
Mm-hmm. And this was, I should have said this at the beginning, 3 months after Pearl Harbor. So if you think about a time that the population was charged, you're hard-pressed to find something comparable to this, I think.
I mean, I know it was reported that day there were, from the Northwest, 2 balloons that came into question there. What's interesting about the balloons, though, they also departed to the Northwest. So I don't know if that time we had something that could travel and then be shot at over 1,400 times. The shrapnel fell and killed 2 people, which is tragic. But then for them to turn around and exit also to the Northwest is highly suspicious. So that's an interesting part of this case as well.
A few years ago, I interviewed a young lady who was a child during this time. She was in elementary school in Japan, and she recounted having her and her classmates coming into a building where they were attaching incendiary devices on the balloons. And they would listen to reports and things, and she was always glad to hear that there was no reports of her balloon going off, right? But we do know in Oregon that there was one device that did go off, and it did kill a few people. So we do know that the Japanese were sending over balloons. in a very innocent-looking ways, yet they were, having incendiary devices on them. So I think that this kind of episode was in the making for a while, ever since the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Right, and look what we're doing to balloons now, right?
Absolutely right.
Shooting them out of the
that's
sky.
right. So yes, we still have that as the culprit.
Yeah.
I see some correlations between this and the Men in Black in a weird way, in that both of these, well, maybe not even, was it? No, the contactee stuff. Both are equal parts about paranoia. This is a very high alert time in American history where anything that it happens that's out of the ordinary can be cause for serious concern. In the contactee situation, it was much more covert because you're dealing with the Cold War and communism and things like that. This is a very overt, wars are being waged between nations, and there was a very real possibility that we could be attacked at any time. So for something this out of the ordinary to happen over LA would be, cause for huge concern on a national scale, not just citywide. And those watches that they were doing, I mean, this was, if I remember right, at this point in time, they had sort of bunkers all along both coasts and Alaska. And so the people that man those bunkers are there specifically to watch our skies and the ocean, for oncoming attacks. And so something out of the ordinary coming in like this and creating chaos, so that's perfectly in line with what you would assume would happen, at that point in our history. Interesting fact about the Battle of Los Angeles, it was the inspiration behind Steven Spielberg's 1941. Which is a hilarious, it's a very high budget comedy from the early 80s that is a very interesting watch.
Well, it's inspired other films as well for reasons that we'll get into shortly, but the 2011 film by the same name, The Battle of Los Angeles, is a very high concept, action-packed, military sci-fi thing wherein these aliens show up on the coast of Los Angeles and we follow the heroes who have to heroically fight them off. So this is an interesting case because it does inspire a lot of pop culture, and even films and TV shows, podcasts, books, comic books that don't necessarily directly draw from it mirror this narrative of this large object appearing over a U.S. city. Katie mentioned a moment ago that the shrapnel fell and that there were some casualties in the city. It wasn't just a couple of shots that they fired at this thing.
It was like over 1,400. And that begs a question. If this was just a balloon, we would see debris. We would have taken it out. And apparently, this thing just kind of kept on going and wasn't, falling out of the skies. So what was it exactly? And I believe, and maybe Micah, the photograph, I think David Marler, who has the National Historical UFO Research Center outside of Albuquerque, he did a deep dive on the Battle of LA and has the headline paper and the photograph there. And what do you know about that part of it?
Well, I will say this. So for years, of course, it has been supposed that there were balloons in the area that were accounted for. Some observers even said that they felt like they saw balloons. Historical UFO researcher David Marler really decided to look deeply into this case, and I think he disputes the balloon idea. And of course, having obtained some of the original photographs that were later disseminated to the press, and on that point, we should really talk about that too. And then I also want to touch on technology and what we had, what we didn't have at that time, which really was a huge part of World War II, and really how it kind of changed the future of America and the world going forward. But in terms of that photograph that's famously associated with this, the photo that was that appeared in the newspapers did show kind of a large object, and there were several spotlights. Most of us have seen this. In fact, I think we've got some images of it right here on the table. The spotlights all trained on a single object in the sky. The photo apparently had been touched up. There had been adjustments to the contrast that were made, which gives a little bit more of the appearance in the photo of a large sort of ellipsoid object. Now that might not have been all that important necessarily at the time, apart from the fact, because Americans, what they were concerned, rather I should say, was going on here, was that Japanese aircraft, like planes, equipped with capabilities to attack with guns or to drop bombs, might be flying over the coast of California. That's obviously not what's appearing in the photograph, and in fact, it's been interpreted later that the photo might show something else. But before we get to that, technology would be good to discuss right here, I think, because as we get into the Second World War, I mean, prior to the Second World War, we didn't have radar. You know, the U.S. and, of course, Britain and Germany, I think Canada also developed this technology at that time, but there are other things too. The Germans, of course, were experimenting with swept-wing aircraft designs and perhaps other things. There are a whole lot of stories about extremely esoteric technologies the Nazis had been developing. We had night vision, I think, in its very earliest forms coming into use during the Second World War. And in addition to these nascent technologies that would define warfare, not only within their first use in the Second World War, but I mean, going forward, we had also the first UFO reports. So important, I think, to point out that people didn't have in their minds at the time of this incident over Los Angeles flying saucers. There were some warfighters, both Allies and Axis, particularly over Europe, but also over the Pacific theater in the later years of the war, that they started seeing objects they couldn't explain, little balls of light. This became known as the Foo Fighters. So the flying saucer idea was new, and a lot of these technologies were also new. And in that context, Americans weren't sure necessarily, what Japan might have. I mean, did they have boats out there in the Pacific Ocean that had managed to get close enough that they could launch aircraft from, and that would give them keeping in mind the extreme limitation due to fuel. I mean, you're not just going to fly your aircraft over the Pacific Ocean, come over and attack, but there were ways it could be done, and we'd already seen with the incident involving I-17, the submarine with the shelling, they could reach our shores. And so people knew it could happen, but they weren't sure what to expect. So balloons were one possibility. Aircraft was our main concern. And whatever they were shooting at, if it was in the sky, they weren't taking any chances. It was decades probably later that people come back, look at that photograph, and they say, we see not only this sort of ellipsoid, but almost like a little cupola on top. I mean, it looks kind of like a flying saucer. And I think it's important to point out that the uncorrected, the uncontrast-adjusted image does not show so distinctively a saucer-type shape as what appears in the famous photo. And I do think that there's been a little misinterpretation of that.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the difficulties with this case. It is well documented. We had tons and tons of witnesses, which is kind of rare. We've talked about a couple other cases where that is apparent, but if you go looking specifically for the original photograph, it's very difficult to identify what that is and where to find it. So, and I think that's part of the way in which this story has spread and become so popular with some people, because, well, here it is. This is proof. This is the picture. The military shot at it. What more do you need? But Katie makes a very important point. If this was a balloon, why were 1,400 plus rounds not able to shoot it down? Based on my very rudimentary understanding of some anti-aircraft ballistic weaponry, it goes up in the air, it explodes, and it spreads out a cloud of debris. Balloons aren't going to do well in that environment. It was also said to move into residential areas and then hover over houses before moving away and moving on to something else. That's something I can see a balloon doing, but I also can see a balloon being shot down. So I'm really glad you raised that point.
And also in this photograph, the spotlights is interesting, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some of the photos depict the spotlights kind of cross and going. You could see that they're not hitting something, but this particular photograph, it looks like the beams of light stop on an object. And they're not continuing through. So I think there is a structure there just based on the light configurations. And of course, when you're firing 14 rounds of anything, it's going to get smoky and cloudy, and the light diffusion, and that is going to cause the illusion to maybe be different. But I think that's an interesting point of this case as well.
Well, we never found anything after this was done, right? So even if it were a blimp or a bunch of birds or something, I mean, there's nothing that was left over when it was done.
Yeah. If it was hit 14,000 times, there's not going to be much left.
Right. Well, that's true. But, I mean, there's not pieces of a plane or anything like that we found.
Right. When we talk about people who were injured, my understanding is that this was a result of the artillery that's being launched also. I mean, there was damage to infrastructure and things like that. So certainly there were injuries. But that didn't mean that some sort of a craft crashed down and fell.
The notes I have say, and this may be inaccurate, again, this is one of those stories that's been reported and repeated a lot, but 5 civilian deaths occurred during the shelling. mostly from heart attacks or traffic accidents caused as a result of the
And
chaos.
you can edit that part out where I said two.
Well, and you may be right too. Again, that's one of
Yeah,
those
it's one of
things.
those
We're not
things we don't know.
records are a little bit spotty. It is documented, but this was quite a while ago.
You know, people were very concerned. I mean, it was obviously a very concerning incident. My understanding also is that Roosevelt was briefed about this after the fact and wasn't extremely happy when he was told, well, we think it was war nerves. So, you know, again, the fundamental question, I guess, that we have about the case is, I mean, there is the official explanation that there were balloons, and there are records that seem to indicate that there had been some balloons in the area at that time, as Katie had mentioned. And then further, there are a few witnesses who, before their death a number of years ago, I recall seeing, and there may even still be a few alive, I think, but I know that like back in, I think, the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a public access television program done in California where several of the witnesses appeared, and some of them had kind of indistinct memories of there being something in the sky. Others said, oh, yeah, it was clearly balloons, which kind of makes me wonder, I mean, had some people actually genuinely seen balloons and maybe others didn't, or they had other, you know, remembrances of what had happened that night. The sticking point, I think, for ufologists over the years, on the other hand, has been, you know, as we've said, you know, whatever you're shooting at, and you know, launched, you know, some of your guns at, you know, I mean, for like a couple of hours, whatever is up there has not come down. I mean, this seems almost impervious to our shelling. So is there something up there that we can't take down, or is this literally, as some had proposed, they are just shooting at things they think they're seeing, literal war nerves? We think that there might be something up there, and we spent 2 hours shooting at nothing. If that were the case, that would be almost more concerning than there being an actual object.
And, well, that's actually what happens in 1940, the Steven Spielberg movie, 1940.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, we had opposing discussion on what actually happened too, coming from the government. We had the Secretary of the Navy saying that it was just a false alarm, there weren't any planes or anything. But then the Secretary of War said, oh, there were as many as 15 planes that were going over. So we weren't even getting a clear explanation when it was done as to what was going on and what caused us to start firing in the first place.
I'm curious when the UFO wave over Washington, D.C. happened. Do you know what I'm talking about? What year was that?
So that was 1952.
Okay,
and
that's later.
Again, the closest in proximity to any known UFO kinds of sightings that Battle of Los Angeles really falls. Now, I should say, Barry Greenwood and a number of other historical researchers have gone back and they have found some really interesting cases, even over the Americas, that occurred during the war, even immediately prior to it. If we go even further back, I mean, Lauren Denault, in one of their very famous books about this, I think it was Mysteries of the Skies, they talk about like UFOs in the early 1900s, even in the 1800s with the airship wave. And they document a few cases in that area that I kind of call the ufological dark ages, right? Because after the 1890s airship wave, most modern historical books that talk about UFOs, they skip over the next several decades, and they, you know, literally go from 1897 straight to 1947 with, you know, Kenneth Arnold sighting over Mount Rainier. There were a lot of sightings of objects that were reported during the war and even prior to it. And although those don't make them into the history books, for some reason there isn't as much interest in that period. I think it's fascinating. So there were sightings occurring around the time involving strange things. The Foo Fighter sightings over Europe would have been the most like relevant UFO sightings that like historians often recognize and talk about. And then in 1952, there were several sightings over Washington, D.C. that Harry Truman was very interested in
that
too.
case, we weren't firing at those the UFOs over Washington, correct?
Yeah, that's
so
right.
It literally, to me, seems like a pretty cut and dried case of this is a very specific time in history where there is the alerts are raised, and because of that, we're much more prone to just start blasting anything unexpected that shows up.
I'll put it this way: if there had been sightings of something that night and we hadn't shot at them, it probably wouldn't be the case that many have latched onto and that many say is still a phenomenon. Even if there were genuine UFOs, it probably wouldn't be recognized as the case that it is if we hadn't tried to shoot at them that night, if that makes sense.
Are there, how many craft or how many lights or whatever are seen that night, or is it just kind of one?
Based on what I've read, it seems that there was one. Now, I think someone mentioned a moment ago, sorry.
I think there were several aircraft seen as well.
Well, yeah, so that it varied. There were people that said that they actually saw a plane come down in the middle of Hollywood, from what I understand. Like, it was all over the map what people claim that they saw, but
Yeah, I think that there had been an early report that there had been an aircraft down, and then later, of course, they say that that probably hadn't been the case. They didn't find any kind of wreckage or anything along those lines. Now, again, calling back to David Marler, a historical researcher who's done a lot of investigation into this particular case, using historical resources. Now, if only he were here, he would really give you a great talk about this, because he's given some excellent lectures. But I think that he makes a argument that there were objects, probably more than one, that had entered the vicinity and left, I think, went back out toward the northwest.
Yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. So it's a very interesting, kind of discussion that's still being had today about this case. There are some who have made, I think, very credible arguments that there may be more to the case than the traditional narrative says. But again, the official explanation is supposed to be that there were balloons that probably had instigated a whole lot of shooting at a whole lot of nothing. And again, that really made for an incredible case that even outside of ufology, whatever you think of this one, it's kind of an extraordinary incident, right? I mean, you're right to compare it to like other famous incidents involving obvious sightings of UFOs over like the White House and over Washington. We didn't shoot at those, but in this case, all hell was breaking loose for a few hours over Los Angeles, literally.
And this might be the incident why we didn't shoot at those things over Washington, D.C. as well, too.
It was a lesson learned.
Yeah.
I have one final point in my notes, and that is that we talked about balloons earlier. It was widely believed to be a balloon attack by the Japanese, and we do see some precedent for that. But at the war's conclusion, the Japanese would deny having any knowledge or involvement in the incident. And I would probably need more knowledge in politics at that time to know any of the reasons why they might do that. But it seems to me, if we're at the war's conclusion, oh, okay, yeah, we did that. Sorry, guys. That's just logically that makes sense to me. So it's interesting that our kind of primary culprit, if you like, amongst many researchers, outright denies having any involvement in this.
And there's also a unique connection there as well, too, because with Roswell, it was also blamed on a balloon, wasn't it?
Again, we go back to Roswell, and this I'm surprised I forgot to mention this earlier. Balloons, it's always a weather balloon. It's always a weather balloon. Some of these modern reports, we know it is a balloon, and that's a whole other question. But it's interesting because there are some of these tropes in here as well. The military denying it, changing the story, then saying that it was a balloon, but it didn't come from here. There's a lot of layers to this, I think, a little bit beyond the surface.
Does anyone know how close Japan ever actually got to like the Pacific that coast, the West Coast?
There was the incident the very day before. They would have been within firing distance. But that was, again, a submarine, not like aircraft. And I would presume the concern had been that if Imperial Army, if they had been able to get some sort of a aircraft carrier, some sort of a ship in that would be used as a launch platform, it wouldn't be inconceivable that there might be aircraft. But I mean, with the limitations of aircraft and during the Second World War, it's pretty obvious why there weren't Japanese planes during the Battle of Los Angeles, but also why many had been concerned about balloons, because it had been demonstrated that a balloon could carry incendiary devices across the Pacific. So
we talked a little bit about the ways that this case and some of these themes intersect with pop culture, but I don't think we've covered them all.
Yeah, the big one that jumps out to me is War of the Worlds. So you've got H.G. Wells' book that inspires Orson Welles to go out and create this radio drama that creates a panic. The amount of panic has been exaggerated in the years since it happened, but there was a legitimate concern over that radio drama being an actual news broadcast about aliens invading Earth. Now, as I was sitting here listening to this, I originally had thought of this point before we started talking about this topic, but the more I'm talking about it, the less I'm thinking that's the case in this situation. I don't think it's a panic for sure, but I don't think it's a panic over aliens. I think it's people that are manning, guns and lookouts over LA, seeing something unusual in the sky, thinking it's an invading army and going, let's blast them.
It does present, a fictional parallel, though, to a real world, not necessarily this case, but the way something like this would happen, the way in which people respond. I'm really glad you make that point.
Thank you.
That's an interesting point, because from the ET perspective, I'm going to pretend like I'm these ETs for a minute. I think it's first of all, I think they're with the Foo Fighters. They're interested in our war. Why are these people fighting, and what technologies are they developing right now? So they're curious about our military and our warring ways. At the same time, it seems like a very dangerous time for them to enter and go over into Los Angeles. Like, why would you put yourself at risk if you're an intelligent being from some other planet? You would know, hey, this just happened the day before. Maybe this is not a good time to be visiting, LA. So I just think from the ET perspective, it just seems like bad planning.
And then they're hovering over residential areas, like almost calling attention to themselves. It's just an odd, from their perspective, if it is a them, that isn't a balloon, why do it? And then why at this particular moment in time do you have the cojones to hover over residential areas when you're already being fired upon? Because by this point, they're being fired.
Yeah. This wasn't, again, one or two shots of like, oh yeah, we fired at it and nothing really happened. This was a full-blown defensive operation. Like everybody had itchy trigger fingers that night.
I think that's a good point, because after everything was said and done, they were still in existence, right? So maybe the whole point was to show they could indeed appear anywhere they wanted to and survive whatever we threw at them.
Yeah, there's one final interesting kind of mythological component that we might inject here too, because there had been some interesting commentaries written about the Battle of Los Angeles over the years. It even went beyond speculations about it being a UFO case, and they'd even gone so far as to say that there'd been an object that resembled a great big moth or like a butterfly, and almost sort of evocative of the idea of Mothman, or that this whatever that was being shot at for a long extended period and they weren't able to take down had this kind of a harbinger-like appearance, similar to some of the kind of cryptid creatures and things that come along in later decades. Now, because of that, I'd gone back and done, newspaper archive research and tried to find any descriptions of this as being anything more than just a UFO, maybe moth-like, butterfly-like, whatever. I could find no such references, although I don't doubt that some people had probably read other references that were also not sourced or traced back to, legitimate newspaper sources, accounts, or descriptions. So it was fascinating to me, and I couldn't find out what the genesis point for that idea was, but that somewhere along the way, this kind of a Mothman-esque kind of a thing ends up getting injected in there, which is not unlike some of these cases from over the years where somebody borrows a little piece from a contactee tale or a little name of a planet from another account, and they work that into their own mythoses, and it turns into this process of myth making. Attempts at that, I think, have been done with the Battle of Los Angeles that even brought it out of so much ufology and more into like Fortean kind of lore.
Well, this is what I'll say about that is you can't, any case that eventually becomes as popular as this one will just naturally, all these little pieces are added to it over the years, and it gets to the point where it's almost impossible to tell what actually happened versus what is like this created narrative that's happened in the years since, that people have added to the mythology surrounding it.
That's what makes our job so difficult.
For sure.
While we know that this dramatic wartime sighting did in fact take place, it leaves many questions unanswered. Among them, if this was a balloon, where did it come from? And perhaps more importantly, where did it go? Regardless of the case, the Battle of Los Angeles will continue to incite speculation and debate, likely for years to come.